One of the strangest unsolved crime cases in history is that of Cindy James. As you will see, the facts revolving around her untimely death are confusing, contradictory, and unnerving. Cindy was terrorized by an unknown assailant for nearly 7 years, moving from house to house without reprieve. Theories about what exactly happened to her range from the mundane to the incredible, but her story is captivating no matter what you hear. To make sense of what happened to Cindy, we have to go back to the beginning. To friends and family, Cindy James appeared to be a happy person. Living in Vancouver during the late 1970s, she dedicated her life to helping others as a nurse. While some have suggested that Cindy may have had an abusive childhood, most testimonies by those who knew her did not back that up. She was, by all accounts, a well-adjusted individual. At the age of just 19, she entered into a relationship with an older man and was soon married. She met her husband, a man named Dr. Roy Makepeace, through their shared profession, and while some were suspicious of the 18 years in age difference between them, they seemed happy, outwardly at least. After developing her career and impressing employers with her abilities as a nurse working with children, the first hints that all was not well in Cindy's life emerged. Cindy and Roy ended their marriage in 1982. This seemed to be the catalyst for the strange events that would haunt her for the rest of her short life. Just 4 months after the end of her marriage to Roy, Cindy began to suspect that someone was stalking her. She felt like she was being watched and began to feel unsafe in her life. Cindy was a committed diary keeper, and she recorded those feelings in her diary entries around this time. It was then that the first real evidence of a stalker emerged. Cindy received several strange phone calls. In the beginning, the person on the other end remained silent. Cindy would pick up the phone and no one would be there, but she sensed someone was on the other end of the line, listening but remaining quiet. One day around this time, Cindy opened the front door to her house and saw that a note had been left on her doorstep. This would prove to be the first of many. Though Cindy didn't show the notes to her family and friends, she described them as cryptic and sinister. Despite this, Cindy never saw who was leaving the notes. It was almost as if she was being targeted by an invisible stalker, someone who knew exactly when to approach Cindy's home to remain undetected. This went on for a while, but soon the harassment grew in intensity. The first sign that the stalker was coming out of his shell was when he began speaking on the phone. The silence of the previous phone calls was replaced by a whisper. It was hard at first for Cindy to understand what was being said, but finally the whispers became more confident, threatening words spoken by a gravelly voice. The voice told Cindy that she would soon die. At this point, Cindy's friends and family began to see the toll that the harassment was taking on her. She looked ill, as though she wasn't sleeping, but when she spoke with local police, they categorized the harassment as mostly harmless and not overly concerning. The stalker, after all, hadn't done anything violent to Cindy or her home. They would keep an eye on things, and Cindy was to contact them if anything worse happened. They did not have to wait long. One day, Cindy stepped into her garden and saw something hanging from the tree out front. The stalker had killed 3 cats, wrapped cords around their necks, and then hung them like twisted Christmas decorations from the branches. Cindy screamed and rushed back into her home. She locked up all of her windows and doors and then picked up her phone to call the police, but the line was dead. The stalker had cut the telephone lines. Cindy stood in the quiet of her home, expecting her stalker to then reveal himself in the shadows. But only the deathly silence of her house greeted her. After gathering the courage to leave her home and find some help, the police were contacted again. This time, they did agree to keep a closer eye on the home. But without 24/7 security, Cindy was still exposed to the dangerous stalker, and she knew that at any moment something terrible could take place, and that soon happened. One night, Cindy's friend Agnes turned up at her house for an impromptu visit. She knocked on the door and waited. When Cindy didn't answer, Agnes grew worried, knowing about the harassment that she had suffered. Walking around to the back of the property, Agnes was shocked to see Cindy crouched down, shivering and hiding. Agnes could see a pair of nylon stockings wrapped around her friend's throat. Cindy was terrified. She had finally been confronted by her stalker. Cindy told Agnes that she had walked into her garage and her stalker had snuck up from behind and wrapped a pair of nylon stockings around her neck. The stalker had strangled Cindy with them. She struggled, but she couldn't fight him off, and she never got to look at his face. When Agnes arrived, the stalker must have seen her and been frightened off. At least that is what Cindy thought at first. She would soon realize, however, that the stalker was only toying with her. With a physical attack finally taking place, the police began to stake out Cindy's home, hoping to catch her attacker when he showed up again. But the stalker remained eerily absent. Soon, the police believed that the danger had subsided. As if the stalker knew this, as soon as surveillance of Cindy's house had relaxed, he began sending his taunting messages again. This time, they were even more violent in nature. One of the notes was left under the windshield of Cindy's car. It wasn't a written message, but instead a picture of a corpse at a morgue. The implication was clear. The stalker meant to kill Cindy. Soon after, Cindy came home to find that her stalker had wrapped a cord around her dog's neck. The animal was still alive, but shaken up by the experience. By this point, the local police were skeptical about Cindy's claims. They told her that they believed she was fabricating some, if not all, of the story. Abandoned by the police department, Cindy had to become proactive. She moved houses, changed her name, and she even hired a private investigator. The private investigator was a man named Ozzy, and he quickly suspected that while Cindy was telling the truth, she was holding critical information from him that he needed to find her stalker. Cindy's father also stated that he believed his daughter was keeping some of the details of her ordeal back, either to protect someone else or to stop her family from being further disturbed by what was happening to their daughter. Hoping that moving would stop the stalking, Cindy was devastated when she realized the stalker had somehow found her again. How, she didn't know. To give her some peace of mind, Ozzy the private detective installed a two-way radio as well as a panic button at Cindy's home so that she could monitor what was going on, even while not there. One night, he heard activity on the radio and rushed over to Cindy's new home. When he entered the house, Ozzy found Cindy lying on the floor with a knife stabbed into her hand. A note attached to the knife promised that Cindy would soon be dead. When Cindy regained consciousness in the hospital, she told the police that she had no memory of the incident and that she suspected she had been injected with something before being stabbed. The police, again, did not believe her. They didn't even take fingerprints at the crime scene. However, they did find a hole in her skin where she had clearly been stabbed with a needle. While the police thought it was all staged by Cindy, Ozzy felt that the needle mark, which was on the back of her elbow, made it more likely that someone else was the perpetrator. Hoping to make the authorities believe her, Cindy volunteered to take a polygraph test, but the results were inconclusive. She was either lying, holding back some information, or too traumatized to give an accurate reading. Eventually, the police carried out more surveillance of Cindy's home when she returned. But every time they were there, nothing would happen. When they were not, a new note would be found delivered. The police took this as evidence that Cindy was the one leaving the notes. Soon after, the police gave up watching Cindy's property, and she was soon found lying in a ditch 6 miles from her home. She was disoriented with no knowledge of what had happened, and bizarrely, she was wearing a man's boot on one foot and a glove on one hand. Yet again, she had a pair of nylon stockings wrapped around her neck. She had a number of bruises on her face and body. After being hospitalized yet again, she returned home. But this time, her friend Agnes and Agnes's husband Tom spent the night. Even with company, the terror would not end. Tom woke hearing something in the basement in the early hours of the morning. Upon investigation, he discovered that a fire had been set. He tried to call 911, but the phone line had been cut. He ran over to the nearest house to ask to use their phone, and when he did, he saw a man down the street in the opposite direction of Cindy's house. But he couldn't be sure if the man was the stalker or not. When the firefighters put the fire out, the police were convinced that Cindy had set the fire herself, but Tom and Agnes refused to believe that Cindy would have endangered their lives. Despite dusting for fingerprints this time, the police found none. Soon after this episode, Cindy was hospitalized for 10 weeks. The records aren't public, but some of her friends said that she had been suicidal due to the stress of everything that she had been through. When she was finally sent home from the hospital, she made a startling claim to the police and her family. She had indeed been holding back information about her attacker. But the question is, why? As it turns out, the attacker said he would kill her entire family if she revealed his identity. Cindy told everyone that the man terrorizing her was none other than her ex-husband, Dr. Roy Makepeace. This might not seem surprising, but there were two problems with this. The first is that Roy had solid alibis for several of the incidents. The second problem is that he too had reported being harassed by someone. In fact, he had a recording on his answering machine of a voice saying that Cindy would be dead soon. Despite pointing the finger directly at her ex-husband, the police still believed that most of the incidents had been faked by Cindy. Her family and friends remained steadfast in the belief that Cindy was the victim, not the perpetrator. Tragically, their greatest fears were realized on May 25th, 1989. Cindy vanished while out grocery shopping. Her car was found abandoned in the shopping mall parking lot. Blood was discovered inside, and the contents of her wallet were strewn across the back seat. The groceries Cindy had picked up were discovered in the trunk of her car. Cindy remained a missing person for 14 days. The police thought it was an elaborate ploy to make people believe her story, but she was eventually discovered. There would be no other claims of abuse and stalking made by Cindy after that day. She was dead.
Cindy James was a nurse who lived in Richmond. Her body was found in a vacant lot there last year, 2 weeks after her family reported her missing.
Her body was lying in the front yard of an old house that no one had lived in for years. Her feet were tied together and her hands were bound behind her back. Her neck had a black nylon stocking wrapped around it. Investigators believed Cindy had been strangled with it. When an autopsy was carried out, pathologists discovered large amounts of morphine in her system. There was a small hole in her arm where a needle had been used, but the needle itself was never found. Despite this, the official cause of death was labeled an unknown event. The stalker, if he ever existed, was never caught. Various theories have been proposed throughout the years to solve this case. The local police were adamant that Cindy had been faking all of the events, perhaps for attention. However, Dr. Roy Peacemaker, her ex-husband, who is a suspect and a trained psychiatrist, argued that Cindy suffered from an extremely rare mental illness. Effectively, he claimed that she had a split personality and that the other personality residing inside of her mind was filled with murderous intent. In essence, Cindy may have been stalking herself without even knowing it. Another theory is that Cindy suffered from a psychiatric illness known as Munchausen syndrome. This condition makes a person want to fake an illness for attention. In this case, Cindy may have faked the attacks to gain sympathy, and her death may have been an unintentional consequence of this behavior. It's been shown that people can tie their own hands behind their backs with practice, so it isn't beyond the realm of imagination that Cindy may have done so. However, others believe that Cindy was a victim of failings by the police in the Vancouver area where she lived. That had they taken her claims more seriously, they could have caught the stalker before she was murdered. If Cindy James was murdered, then who could have done it? Her ex-husband had an alibi and claimed to have been harassed himself. One theory is that Cindy was actually a lesbian and that she was hiding this all along. Back in the 1980s, people were not as understanding about the LGBT community. Some researchers have argued that Cindy left her husband for a woman and that the relationship ended 4 months later. Cindy then refused to name the person because she was scared of how her family would react to finding out about her sexuality. If you listen to the voicemail left on Cindy's ex-husband's answering machine, it does sound like a woman putting her voice on like a man. Was it Cindy or her lover? Another theory is that Cindy had been in a romantic relationship with a police officer who worked locally. Not only that, but that he had proposed marriage to Cindy and she had turned him down. Some believe that this man is Cindy's stalker, and this explains why he knew when the police were watching Cindy's house and when they were not. The truth is that no one knows the truth. Hopefully one day the death of Cindy James will be solved and her family can gain some comfort from that. Until that time, Cindy's stalker, if he does exist, is still out there walking the streets. Thank you so much for watching this, and remember to follow me on Twitch at twitch.tv/Matthew Santoro, as well as Discord at discord.gg/Matthew Santoro. Both communities are amazing, and I go live every single day to chat with you guys and play games. I hope to see you over there, and as well as in the next video.